a pleasure to have one of the two most beautiful panels before and after lunch. It's the second time in a row that we have the 5G between us and the lunch. I think it's a great opportunity now with you here and also present over virtual presence to speak about the challenges on 5G in the COVID-19 area. And I would like to remind everybody to keep it short and crisp. And I would like to start with the first question. How did COVID-19 impact 5G deployments and activities worldwide? Over to you, Kamal.
Oof, that's a difficult question because there were plans underway already, and the deployment of 5G in at least the two countries where we had started deploying in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, it went ahead on schedule. Now, what happened is that with the corona pandemic, the importance of broadband, the importance of providing the best service possible became so much more prominent. Everybody demanded a better service. All our subscribers were asking for that. We saw in Saudi Arabia, for example, where there was a constraint on the spectrum that was made available, the government took the initiative and made more spectrum available, albeit on a temporary basis, that made the deployment of these networks easier. And from that, I think there's a lesson that goes beyond Corona. The lesson is that spectrum is such a central part of not just 5G, of any telecom service. And I think we should come back and discuss that in more detail. The message is that making the spectrum available on time in the quantities and the quality that is required and at the price or all the conditions associated with that is so central to having the best service deployed.
Thank you, Kamal. Haitam, over to you, and good to see you virtually. To the same question, or do you want me to repeat the question? We don't hear you. Okay. Yeah. So then we go over to Paul. Paul Michael.
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for inviting me. And I apologise I'm not able to be there, but I think everybody understands the challenges. Perhaps the way I'd like to answer the question is, because we couldn't travel, we found ways of doing things differently. We found ways to work from home. We found ways to be educated from home. We found ways to have healthcare at home. Okay, so I like to call 2020 the Sputnik moment. It's the year that the world realised that we can do things differently. And to the point of our first colleague who just talked about the spectrum component, if you survey about 40 countries, you'll find that various governments have now learnt the value of getting spectrum right of way. It's an enabler. And they understand this because 5G is a platform for transformation, and they can see that it transforms. So certainly beyond COVID, we are going to see that this change in behaviour is actually the normal behaviour. Who would have thought 10 months ago that an operator, a telecom operator, could monetize broadband video for education or for the health sector, for example? And today, of course, we have enough analytics, enough information to know that not only is this possible, but it's a very positive business case. So I believe post-pandemic, this will become normal and you'll see an acceleration. How did some companies, work with the pandemic? An example of Huawei, we carried on manufacturing during the entire period from Chinese New Year in the middle of February all the way through. We doubled the workforce, in fact, to maintain the factories rolling 24/7 because we knew the world would require the demand. In Wuhan, we relocated 8,000 employees right to the factory, right to the point there with PPE and masks and temperature tests and COVID tests, etc., so the workforce could continue. So we adjusted ourselves, and I believe that's exactly what the world is seeing now. You see the new behaviour, this normal behaviour creates a lot of opportunities, but you can't deploy it. And if you can't deploy it, then you have challenges. But I believe you'll see an enormous rise in 5G take-up across industry, not only in consumer.
Thank you very much, Paul. Femi, over to you, and it's a pleasure to have another panel with you.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise, I wish I was there as well. I'll just take it from a slightly different angle. COVID certainly did have an impact, no question. The supply chains were disrupted. Some companies were able to respond to it better than others. Operators saw a very different revenue mix. Voice revenues went down, data revenues went up. I've looked at some of the revenues of the operators in our regions. The more mature operations managed to keep their revenues relatively flat and EBITDA relatively flat, plus or minus a little bit. And then operations like Egypt, it's much talked about today so far, actually saw significant increases in revenues in the subsidiaries of some of our operators on the panel today as well. What that tells, on the other hand, it did come at the impact of, at the cost of reduced capex. I'm talking of the Middle East and Africa region. So we did see some slowdown. But I'm really impressed with the way operators have adjusted to this unprecedented circumstances. And what that tells me is they will be well positioned, STC, Etisalat, MTN, and several others in the region. They'll be well positioned, much better than I feared just 3 months ago, to restart the investments in 5G. We've heard of all the advantages of 5G, so I'm very hopeful, much more positive than I was, that there will be a reinvigoration of investments and money poured in the direction of 5G, given all the use cases that we've now learned. We've now seen work from home, schooling, gaming. We've now started to see that industries, there's been an accelerated need. So I'm in a very positive frame of mind when it comes to 5G going forward.
Thank you very much, Femi. Over to you, Archie.
Yeah, I mean, I think the COVID situation has transformed the whole world in the past few months. So I think the initial focus was, of course, to really look at basic connectivity, providing basic connectivity to everybody, and connecting the unconnected people. So obviously looking at from the network operator perspective or even from a vendor point of view. So if you ask me about the 5G deployment, yes, of course, as a part of it, we witnessed this kind of a bit of slowdown in the 5G deployment overall around the world. However, we see that in the recently, there is a momentum coming back to 5G deployment. Just to give an example from Nokia side, so we had 5G deals momentum, if I talk about it, from 89 deals which we signed, from that increased from 89 to 125 in the past few weeks. So which indicates there is a momentum which is coming up, but of course we need to be cautious, and I'm sure that things will change over a period of time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think I saw that Haitem now joined. Hi, Haitem. The first question was, how did COVID-19 impact 5G deployments and activities worldwide? Would you like to give your view on this as well?
Yeah, please. Thank you. And first of all, maybe let me thank you for the opportunity and join esteemed members, joining the panelists. And when we talk about, the impact of COVID against 5G, I think it varies with the market. The market and different operators depends on the readiness and the pre-investment, the timely investment that happens with operators, especially on 5G. And I think there are two areas when we speak from STC perspective, and I think we in STC were very much determined since 2017 really to put an investment and modernize our existing LTE network, which we think that this sits as a strong foundation for the 5G non-standalone network. And this is what we have done since we start, investing, back in middle 2018 to start rolling out our 5G networks. And I think that investment pays off during the COVID. But the challenge that I think that STC and probably global, operators globally is the availability of devices. And I think the availability of devices was, especially when you look into the market in the kingdom of GCC, where probably Apple have a majority share on this had impacted really the uptake of the 5G. But I think from different markets, there were the supply chain risks that we have seen probably at the beginning of COVID that probably have impacted. But I think what's important out of COVID is we expect, I think one of the gentlemen referred into what we expect post-COVID. I think there will be a lot of acceleration towards rolling out 5G, and we have seen the importance of having a robust digital infrastructure that can contribute into different industries, business continuity, and risks, because we have seen the digital adoption have seen. So I would expect that there will be much more opportunities and there will be much more attention in the future around 5G to accelerate deployments. But again, it varies between different markets and different situations that we will go through.
Thank you very much, Hatem. The second question goes to the mobile and telecom operators here. Amid the challenges imposed by the pandemic on spectrum allocations and auctions, what measures can be beneficial for mobile operators to expedite 5G rollout? And as Kamal is not only from an operator, but also works in regulatory, I think you will have to say a lot.
Thank you, Johannes. Very good question. Evidently, deploying these 5G networks, in fact, any telecom network, is not a knee-jerk reaction. It's not even something that you plan in 2 or 3 or 6 months. These things take a lot of preparation. And central to that is your spectrum planning. If you decide that you're going to split your spectrum into smaller plots, you're going to make it very difficult for any operator to deploy sustainable networks, and good quality throughput will not be available to your population. I think that is the central point. This takes time, and again, it's not something that can be sped up. A lot of thought has to go into that. Number two, the conditions under which you offer that service has to be made flexible, because this is a new service. I think one of the issues we have is regulators and governments tend to look at 5G as just another G, just another service, and they have, for most operators in many markets, at least in the region, the same approach about price approvals, about price caps, and so on. If 5G is to be deployed, one has to recognize that most of the uses for 5G will require investments that are not commensurate to the investments that have been made. Hence, you need to have the commercial flexibility to respond. The more commercially flexible you are as an operator, which is, of course, this is what regulations have to allow, the faster the deployment, more companies will deploy. So I think we're looking at two very important principles that have to be put into practice on spectrum and on price flexibility. I think those are the two pillars on which you can build a good 5G or any G network.
Thank you very much for that. Hatem, do you want to take this question as well?
Yeah, I mean, spectrum allocation is and spectrum at large is an important asset when it comes for rolling out 5G. And I think when we speak about the kingdom, we have seen a good timing when the regulator really put the 5G spectrum into an auction, and we have seen flexibility when it comes for even the auction conditions to motivate existing operators really to put their investment on 5G. So I think it's an important subject. Lots of, I would say, government and regulatory bodies will look into spectrum allocations and strategy on 5G, different probably from the previous technology, even the 4G and the 3G and others, because I think we have also to probably think that the investment on networks became and the amount of capex that operators are putting in those networks are extremely challenging. So there will be a lot of, I would call it concessions or some sort of support and levers that will be given to operators really to to motivate them to put much more investment on the 5G front. But I think there are techniques that will come and depends on the vendor readiness when it comes for carrier applications and these kind of things to maximize the usage or the utilization of the spectrum resources against what operators they have.
Thank you very much. Anyone else from the panel who burns to answer these questions from the vendor side? Yes. Of course, Asa, over to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. No, actually, what I would like to answer is a couple of things. If you look at the data that we've gotten from providers, and I happen to talk to a whole bunch of providers around the globe, in terms of impact of COVID, and then also in terms of the spectrum conversations. So very quickly on the impact of COVID, the video traffic's been up more than 230%. VPN traffic has been up more than 700%. Gaming traffic has been up more than 75%. And this is all from March 1st baseline. And if you take internet exchange traffic, it's gone up by more than 30%. So this has obviously had an impact for all of the telcos around the globe. And I've sampled data from different internet exchanges and to see how the traffic peaks and troughs are. Also, in April, we had about 75 operators around the globe who had launched a commercially compliant 3GPP compliant 5G service. And today, as of September 30th, we have now 94 operators who have launched a commercially compliant 3GPP 5G service around the globe. This means, yes, COVID has probably had an impact on some of the supply chain stuff that Femi was talking about earlier. But in terms of the actual rollout plan of 5G, if only, I think it has accelerated for all of the carriers around the globe. Now, coming to the spectrum conversation briefly, the spectrum allocation, unfortunately, is all over the map across the globe that we've seen, at least. As an infrastructure provider and as somebody who's talking to different providers around the globe, there is a huge amount of interest in terms of moving forward with respect to spectrum allocation in many places. Where there is, people are repurposing some of the existing spectrum. People are stitching, different carrier frequencies together, doing carrier aggregation to actually start off with some sort of a 5G service inside their countries. And I think people are being more innovative, in my opinion, in terms of where things, where they want to take it, because the demand from the customer side is incredible.
Thank you for this, Asa. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Sorry, let me take it. So I think definitely I agree with all the panelists that the COVID is accelerating the digital transformation, and then the requirement to deploy maybe 5G faster, right, to offer this increased broadband experience to the users overall. But I think also there is something that the industry should be careful about, which is it's not only about speed, it's getting it right. And let's look at the Korean example. And the major quality of service issues were experienced by the users. And more than 5%, by the way, gave back their 5G contracts and went back to the 4G. And that was a combination of, because the industry, to go faster, decided to go on a non-standalone core, right? Core network, which in fact induces latency, when the mobile keeps switching off between the 4G and the 5G, also eats a lot of the battery. And then the promised speed, which is like 20 times what the 4G offers, etc., were not met. All this created issues with the operators. So I think with the consumers, and right now there is, I feel, a much greater understanding that there are ingredients for success. One is adoption of spectrum allocation should be organized in the upper bands, the 28 gigahertz band, which allows to provide that quality of service that is expected, or quality of experience expected by the users, number one. It's not only about the 3.5 gigahertz band that we are seeing now. It's not the real 5G, what we're seeing. Second thing is core network needs to be standalone and in the cloud. We've seen people like Telefonica Germany announcing that their 5G network will be on AWS, for example, or will move there. So this is very important. the automated operations, and we will talk about it later. And the last thing that, to complete the picture and will be ingredient of success is also the private 5G networks. And we're talking about, spectrum only for the operators, but also in Germany, for example, 74 licenses have been granted, like 100 megahertz tranche was reserved to those private 5G networks to serve the industries. So in my opinion, yes, speed is essential here, and the COVID pandemic is maybe enticing people to accelerate, but the industry need to get it right to deliver on the promise of 5G and then enable its monetization.
Thank you.
Can I just, on this point, I think it's good to have maybe a slight difference of opinion. I think the term that 100 megahertz was allocated for the use of the industries is misleading, because the industry still has the capability to have their own private network. Today with 5G, with network slicing, a mobile network operator can actually give these private companies their own network in a more efficient way even. So they will have that use. The question is how they use it. Unfortunately, when you let the policy debate be driven by people who want to sell boxes, and I apologize to our sponsors because they sell boxes, they will take it in a different direction. The reality is, as an operator, I want to make sure that this spectrum is used in at least the same efficient way as the spectrum that is allocated to the mobile network operators. And we are expected as mobile network operators to make the most of every megahertz of every piece of spectrum that we get. And the same standards have to be applied as well to the private industries. And if it were applied, you will find that there are issues, there are problems, because there will be delays, and they cannot be held to the same standards. So I think for the sake of having as fast a deployment as possible, I like the question, how much will private industry want to use? But I think the solution is not necessarily by allocating reserving certain bands to the industry and waiting for that to be developed. In places like Germany, where Volkswagen or Mercedes is clamoring for it, is saying, I have these solutions, I can understand at least making room for it. But if you're entrusted with managing the spectrum, you have to ask yourself, what is the best use of that spectrum? And what is the best way to offer the service? Because if operators can do it just as well, let it be an open and competitive framework.
I must say I agree. Good. Over to...
I have the moderator on my side.
Yeah, I'm also a mobile operator, kind of. What is the impact of 5G and network edge on data center locations and transformation of central offices? And what impact does this have on the scale and management of these environments? That was a question that Red Hat is burning to answer, so over to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. About 2 years ago, ABA started an activity to actually modernize this central offices. And there are multiple initiatives in the industry that Red Hat's been part of, but they are all community and industry driven. In terms of virtual central office or central office redirected as a data center. The idea was to essentially seed these central offices with general purpose hardware and leverage the power of virtualization and/or microservices architecture to be able to run these components in software and deploy them closer to the subscriber. That was, coming from a need of the need for virtualization so that we can efficiently, deploy those types of services. Two, edge started to become a primary conversation both in the context of 5G and in the context of non-5G, which is whether it's cable architecture or whether it is, a wireline broadband architecture. Because edge services started to become more and more important for customers. So with these things driving that conversation around deployment of infrastructure in different locations, be it from far edge locations to near edge locations or regional data centers to centralized locations. People wanted the same look and feel, same experience, same capability, regardless of the footprint size. And so what we've tried to do is actually work with our customers, work with telcos worldwide, to try and build a horizontal platform that allows you to go deploy these kind of different types of footprints, which means massive scale. Now you have to look at how do you manage that type of massive scale environment? How do you provision software resources? And oh, by the way, I disagree with the previous speaker. I'm not a box vendor, I'm a software supplier, and I build horizontal platforms. So what we've been really trying to do is build those type of horizontal platforms that cater to the diverse requirements from running radio software, RAN software, to the core software, to the backend OSS VSS software, across a same or similar look and feel type of infrastructure, and optimize that and be able to run that across the entire infrastructure. So those are some of the challenges. That's what we've been trying to solve. I can't say we're there yet in terms of solving all possible problems, but we have been working incredibly hard with some really innovative carriers around the globe to make that happen.
Perfect, thank you very much. Anyone else burning to answer to this?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's, just on the edge, the edge data center are going to be, an edge in particular is going to be an essential component of this, of delivering the 5G kind of service and the use cases to the customers. And we have to think of a telco that is right now real-time on demand, where services, and this is the key thing about the data center, that the whole network will be running on a data center, and the mentality is I need to provide a service real-time on demand. So, which means that everything I build needs to be in microservices that I can spin up at any point in time in my data center to deliver a service that is demanded, and then I can collapse it and then recombine a new service. So the mentality of having one service that I design, I roll out, and it's there for 1 year or 6 months sitting on my product catalog, etc. And then it takes me another year to build a new service or a few months is going to fade away for this much more dynamic and agile approach enabled by the containerization, the microservices, and the telco running on a data center. Thus offering this as a platform for the network as a platform and as a service to a variety of user and industries.
Clear, Munir, thanks. And
maybe I would comment on that as well. So I think first of all, let me clarify. So Nokia is a bots provider plus software provider. Okay, so just to set the scene. So coming to the edge topic, I think the edge computing or edge cloud is not something new. I think we've been talking about it for a few years already. So from the LTE space, if I talk from the RAN perspective, so LTE as well, we were talking about edge computing because of the mobile multi-access edge computing, MVC, which came into picture for the local breakout, video caching, and so on. But of course, with 5G coming into picture, this is becoming much more, let's say, diverse in terms of use cases, what can bring in the low latency, what we are talking about, because it would not have been possible with the LTE to a large extent, because 5G really brings the low latency. And that connects with the spectrum topic as well, because without having the right spectrum available for the low latency use cases, obviously the whole end-to-end chain is not going to work. So this is all linked together, but edge perspective, of course, this is the edge cloud, there is a mid cloud, you can say far edge cloud and centralized data centers. All of these elements, we need to put in the architecture in the right way to make sure that these use cases can be implemented. So, and all this artificial intelligence and machine learning, which can be embedded into this edge cloud. And that's where the differentiation would come into picture.
Paul, do you want to say something as well? You are mute.
I think
we don't hear you well, unfortunately.
Prefers to use case.
I would prefer to talk about use cases. the MEC component. But one thing I would amplify is that more contiguous spectrum, the broader it is, of course, that's where the efficiencies come. That's why, as the regulator was mentioning, we do need extended, and you have gigabits of spectrum potentially available. So the broader the spectrum, the more flexibility you have in spectrum allocation. Of course, it's an incentive, but the challenge we have is the DNA of the operator. But I'd rather talk about use cases.
Yep. Thank you very much. So if
I could comment
Femi shows me,
on the edge.
over to you.
So we've used the word edge almost a million times in the last 2 minutes, but we forget that it needs to be built, and it is already boxes. It needs to be street furniture, local, 10, 15 meter poles, as close as possible to the end user. It's racks and cabinets and data centers that we talked about. Again, not in the 10s and 20s, but now in the hundreds of thousands, depending on the size of the network operator. And all this stuff needs to be built. It needs to be backhauled. It needs to be powered. I think we've talked a lot about spectrum, but the regulator can help in some of these areas to facilitate, engage, help with the licensing and the use of these ventures. Perhaps even facilitate sharing with existing the furniture that is owned by the existing incumbent, but also perhaps transport companies, electricity companies, and so on and so forth. I think we forget that there is a lot of investment that needs to go into that space to get this low latency that we also desire. If you don't get that right, like Nina talked about earlier in South Korea, you have the wobbly start to 5G, right? In the Gulf countries, this is probably less of a problem. But if I may, you think Morocco, Egypt, or the like, there's still a lot of investment to get a really high performance 5G network to do all the things that Azure, for example, has talked about.
Thank you. Haitem, do you want to say something as well, or shall we jump to the next question?
I think I would agree with everything. The gentlemen have just lots of comments, but the only message that they want to, I think, want to emphasize on that everything is moving to software. And when speaking about telecom operators, is a big mind shift, and have to happen. In the past, we've been dealing with appliances, now we're dealing with software. It requires lots of capabilities, cybersecurity experience. But again, this is the trend. This is where lots of future use cases and capabilities that will be demanded from different markets that telcos and as well as vendors and service providers, technology providers need to accelerate, the journey around edge computing, because virtualization in telco we have been speaking about since 2012, since forming ETSI standards and other things. It will accelerate further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We often hear the term edge cloud. What does that mean, and how is it impacting this transition? This is a question specific for our friend from Red Hat, who I think is well placed to answer it, and then we jump over to the fifth question.
Thank you again. So there were some very interesting points made earlier by Femi and Haitham, I think, around the edge conversations. Now, what does it mean to have an edge cloud? There is a conversation now going on between telcos and hyperscalers in terms of building out that particular edge footprint. I agree with Femi totally that edge requires investment. Edge is not going to come for free. It's not something that you can just turn on in your existing infrastructure without completely looking at the particular infrastructure in terms of how to build, how to design, how to manage, because it's a massive scale. So there's an interesting conversation that's happening between hyperscalers and telcos in terms of building that particular edge footprint out. And that may drive in some countries around the world that I have seen specifically, it's driving a footprint build out of the hyperscalers, the public cloud providers, into the edge as an initial investment model. That doesn't mean the telco does not need to invest with respect to edge. So that's one. The second, in terms of edge, Because now you have a footprint that's so much closer to the subscriber, you can now afford to put application services control plane with respect to 5G much more closer to those subscribers. That implies, as I think there were a couple of other comments previously about things like local breakout. You can do local breakout of traffic, but then definitely address via local breakout a way to handle latency, a way to provide low latency services. Now, what Red Hat is being very good in doing is enabling the software infrastructure to be deployed at the edge, managed, automated, so that you get the exact same cloud-like experience that you would have for your private or public cloud environment as you would for the edge. So when we talk about edge cloud, that's what we mean. That's exactly what we mean, which is exact same cloud-like experience, the ability to manage hardware, the ability to manage the infrastructure, the ability to deploy applications in the infrastructure, and be cognizant of where the user's needs are and schedule them. All software driven. That's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about an edge infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Asa. So now the fifth question of 7. What is required today of regulators to launch the 5G momentum again? And with great pleasure, I hand over to Kamel.
Okay, thank you. So I talked about spectrum, talked about commercial flexibility on pricing of 5G services, but I also think we need to talk about changing the mindset of governments and regulators on virtualization and cloudification. If you, as an operator, have to achieve greater efficiency, these artificial borders that are imposed on a service that can be virtualized and therefore cost reduced tremendously, I think those limitations have to be relaxed. And let me put it in different ways. Regulators in most parts of the world, except for Europe, still cling to very strict restrictions about keeping the data in country, as if all data were born or created equal, which is not the case. Not any data that crosses border is going to reveal information about your subscribers. Data can be anonymized, it can be pseudonymized. You can actually move data across borders, and if you just relax that restriction on operators, an incredible saving can be achieved. And in competitive markets, which is effectively all the markets that we operate in, that will be passed on to the end user. So I think that is a very important change as well from regulators. The last point I want to make about what regulators should do and policymakers should do, I think here it's very important to match reality with expectations. What we see is a world where, partly driven by the hype, and there is a hype, let's face it, 5G has come with a lot of hype, yeah? And this hype now is settling down as we realize that there are some use cases, but we're still waiting to see the demand for these. People are not putting money and saying, I want to have it, I want to deploy it. This hype has created a complete break between reality and expectation, especially in developing markets. What is happening is that regulators, governments, think about 5G as if it were, it has to be a social good. You've got to provide it to everybody in the lowest possible price, but yet I want a Rolls-Royce at the price of a Volkswagen Beetle. I think someone has to, bring some sense into them, these policymakers and regulators, and tell them, you cannot have a Porsche, a Mercedes, a Rolls-Royce, whatever your heart desires, for the price of a Volkswagen Beetle. Very simple. And so, while I see people who we call themselves, internet evangelists or tech evangelists, and they go around and say, oh yes, 5G, that's, this is the nirvana, the reality is, to achieve that, to get there, one has to match reality with expectations, and this is an expensive service. It is not going to be, provided in the same way, at the same cost as, say, your 3G or 4G service. That, I think, that's the reality, and I wish that the learned people in this audience would just tone down the hype a little bit, and have an honest-to-goodness discussion with policymakers that it is not the same thing. If we start from that, I think we're on the right track.
Thank you very much. Haitham, I guess you have something to say on that one as well, and I would like to hand over to you.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of points which we probably, I think there should be, lots of changes that probably might happen in the regulation landscape, mainly around how to promote investment and innovation. And this goes back into probably putting serious considerations when it comes for pricing, maybe and other aspects around the duration of the licenses and that we used to see for 15, 20, 30 years being faster than the previous generation. It's not might be applicable, it might be viable, but it depends on the acceleration and the return from 5G. So there might be possible ideas of what they call the license trades. So this can be probably potentially, and have flexibility in the future. I think all of this sits around the policies and try to, having regulators consider the challenges that operators are facing, specifically with the introduction of OTT players are going into, providing services on top of, internet at large. And again, definitely, is try to make sure that we provide different varieties and different bands that might suit different markets and different needs.
Thank you very much. So I make a wild guess that our friend from Huawei has something to say around this as well, and would therefore hand over to Paul Michael.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I would like to start always with the business opportunity rather than the technology components. And I think our colleague earlier was absolutely right. We actually need to talk about the facts, 5G. So that means we need good education. We need to educate not just people, but the regulators and the ministers, because if you don't understand exactly how things can be transformed or how to use the technology, you're never going to get there. So I 100% agree with this. So let's just take some examples of business cases that are absolutely guaranteed to work in 5G. We know that, an example in the Gulf, we have in excess of 300,000 fixed wireless access subscribers. Right? We know that, and that's good business for the operators and very good for the consumers. That's a B2C environment. But we also know if you extend that, you can rapidly deploy the same kind of technology to the SME market. And again, in the Gulf area, I think it's about 1,200, moving towards about 2,000 SMEs that have been enabled by using 5G in this fiber-like scenario. So then let's talk about big picture. We're in the midst of COVID, and if we wanted to save 1 billion lives, there are 2 or 3 very good use cases in predictive, using examples of high-definition video consultation, which we're doing now. We've proven that it works, and also examples of remote patient monitoring. We've proven that those things work because we're doing it right now. 5G will enable that to be better because of network slicing, allowing us to manage the uplink and the quality of the SLAs to those individual sectors. So we know that there's business opportunities there. And if we took a manufacturing facility, we know that predictive maintenance will improve by around 1% is $150 billion. So these have been demonstrated and proven. And if you want to improve the GDP around 2%, we need to correct all the traffic infrastructure. So how do we do those 3 things? Well, the first one is you need to build networks inside the manufacturing facility, and you need the 5G and IoT chips in the robots and the conveyor belts. In the hospitals, you need everything connected in there, which means you need to build the 5G network indoors. And the transport network, well, that means you need to connect all the roadways. So now you have to think about a different deployment methodology. And I agree with the colleague, I think Femi, you mentioned earlier, we need to share infrastructure like the lampposts. In China now, last count is about almost 700,000 5G base stations. I think we have about 50,000 here in Shenzhen, just with a population of 15 million. How did we do that? We built 5G on lampposts. We share this infrastructure. So if we can educate the right people in in government departments to understand that, we want to improve manufacturing, we want to improve transport, we want to improve logistics, or we want to improve healthcare. And how do we do it? So I believe it's educate, collaborate. We can't do it alone. It's not about a vendor or a regulator. It's about multiple groups of partners on application developments, whether it's an MSC-based solution or not. But it's really about this, and I believe collaboration is the best, so incubation is the best way to demonstrate it. Pick a scenario with a telecom operator and different vendors and partners, prove that it works, prove the business model, prove the deployment architecture, demonstrate it to the regulatory people and to the government, and then from there they can make the right sort of policies to say, yes, this will transform our economy.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this. Femi, do you want to contribute as well? I just want to remind that we have 2 questions left, so we have to speed up a little bit.
I'll be very quick. To support Dr. Kamal's point, I think that argument, I hope for you, with suppliers to operators like yourselves, I hope for you that argument is easier today, because if it wasn't for the operators that picked up the slack when we were all locked down, think of the economies across the region, right? What would have happened? So I hope that argument is much easier than it would have been 6-7 months ago, that the operators the regulators or the more collaborating with the operators and support. I would even go as far as saying, perhaps not in the Gulf countries, but in the next tier of countries, we should even consider subsidy in exchange for investments in 5G. I hope that argument is easier to make. I mean, just the statistics, as I spat out earlier, just shows that you could not make an investment in this space, and it would be detrimental to any country's development to slow that down.
Thanks, Femi. Ajay?
Yeah, I think most of the points were covered already. So if I just summarize, I think from my perspective, I think there are 3 aspects. One is, of course, about the spectrum. I mean, you talk about low band because if you are really talking about the low latency use cases, you need the low band spectrum. Without that, you cannot do it. And mid band, luckily in UAE and Saudi, I think we have the mid band spectrum already allocated, which is fine, which is good. But of course, we need to look at the millimeter wave spectrum. And I kind of, I would like to evangelize a bit on the technology itself, but I cannot stop talking about it because yesterday, interestingly, we achieved 8 gigabits per second in 5G. This is the kind of world record. But it's not that we will achieve this everywhere. It was using millimeter wave spectrum. And personally, I'm happy with that because from 2015 onwards, in the vision strategy discussion when I'm having with the operators, one of the achievements, one of the key requirements for 5G was 10 gigabits per second, But we are closing there. But of course, long way to go in terms of really getting into the reality, getting into the specific use cases where we can implement those. The second element is making it smoother for the rollout for the operators. I think this is definitely very important because 5G will bring different architectures. This is small cell, like Paul mentioned, kind of enabling the operator to implement on any infrastructure, whichever is the easiest possible with approvals and administration overheads and so on. And the third, but not the least, I would say that it is the kind of new use cases, how to enable the operators to build the new use cases. Help them with probably, in some countries, we need to provide them additional spectrum for trial or use cases, some policy regulations, and so on. I would say these are the fundamental things which would help to accelerate the momentum for 5G.
Thank you, Ajay. Azhar?
A couple of quick points in terms of, I think what's really driving the conversation is, different types of use cases. Although people talk about, every time 5G is mentioned, the moment it's mentioned, they say, oh, low latency, oh, AR, VR, oh, autonomous vehicles. But that's just the tip. Literally, that's probably also nirvana in some cases, right? In the sense that, yes, that's what we are trying to achieve, but there are so many other use cases that are relevant in the context of 5G and edge deployment that are very real today. I can give you a couple of interesting examples that I've been working with providers with respect to edge conversation, 5G conversation and the business drivers that Paul was talking about earlier. I was talking to a company called Nexar, and what they do is they build dash cams. In US, as you know, it's a litigious society where insurance companies are encouraging people to put a dash cam on their dashboard while you drive your car, and it records a video continuously on a memory card. And if, in case you run into an accident or something happens, you can actually remove the memory card and give it up to the insurance company. And you know that you are not at fault, of course, those things. So it's an interesting phenomenon that people have taken up, that you see actually a lot of cars, people deploy dash cams in their cars. Because it's a society that's driven by certain rules, regulations, insurance, and litigation. But however, now this company is looking towards monetizing that particular video feed. Why? Because when you're driving, you can actually look at the traffic conditions, the weather conditions, the road signs, the construction that's happening, and provide that information in real time or near real time with analytics to companies, to transportation companies, to package delivery companies, to environmental monitoring capabilities. And what they want to be able to do is take this video feed, stream it, do analytics on it, and then provide that data back in an open data format to different companies to be able to use it so that they can then take remedial action associated with that. It's a very, very interesting use case. It doesn't require AR, VR. It doesn't require those typical things, but it does require a high bandwidth connection, a near real-time capability, and that can be achieved through this type of mobile infrastructure deployment. So what I'm really trying to get to is there are enormous amount of use cases and business drivers like these that are pushing people to drive and deploy. Yes, it's an investment, absolutely. And yes, it doesn't come for cheap, that also I agree. But there's also a way to drive new opportunities, new business that will enable these telcos. And if you drive your infrastructure towards a more software-enabled infrastructure, your costs are far lower than your typical 3G type of deployment models that you have seen. And I have experiences within region that Red Hat's been working through to see those type of benefits.
Thank you.
Yes.
Before.
So some of these services.
Munir is still to come, right?
Sorry.
Munir is still to come.
Yes, sorry.
I give you the last word, but Munir.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I want to raise an important point because here we're talking about, various use cases or, the promise of 5G and how to get there. We spoke about, various aspects. The key thing is, in my view, is monetization. And the most obvious and this easiest asset that mobile network operators will have to monetize initially on 5G, in my view, is the SLAs and the quality of service and the differentiation. That is the key asset before anything else that needs to be monetized. Now, for this to be monetized, it requires two things. It requires first, and by the way, because I believe that mobile network operators are the best poised to deliver even for enterprises, these kind of all these value-added services and transform industry verticals. It requires two things. One is a policymaker who is making it possible for operators, as Kamal mentioned before, to implement innovative business models and pricing policies that allows people who are ready to pay premium to get that quality of service to get it, right? And there are today studies that show people are ready to a certain extent in different markets to pay more, especially in the enterprise, in the enterprise business. The second thing is digital operations. So the entire operation of the operators need to be transformed to enable this delivery and monetization of SLAs and quality of service on 5G services. This means multiple things. This means, this will be delivered when we are able to spin up 5G slices and deliver them and guarantee the SLA on these 5G slices. It means automation, because you can't have people and you need to invest on people, but you can't just rely on the human factor. There will be a latency there that you can't live with. So you need to have greater automation. You need to have agility, and that is brought by the various flavors of cloud. And finally, you need the softwareization and the simplification of architectures that have been built through the years, where you have thick silos that were built between IT and network, for example, etc. So you need much greater simplification of the operation. So automation, softwareization, simplification are essential ingredients to enable that delivery and the monetization of this quality of experience that will allow a return on the 5G investment. And that has to come with the policy and with the investment in the network. These are three pillars that need to go hand in hand to enable that, the fulfillment of the 5G promise.
Thank you, Munir. Last words to this point from Kamal.
Thank you. So some of those use cases that are only now being deployed are actually delivered on 4G. You don't actually need, you don't need 5G for. Some you do, but for many of those, 4G is good enough. Let's face it. But the critical thing here is that we are at the beginning of an era of innovation in providing new services in new ways that we can barely imagine. I mean, we're beginning to see that, but there's going to be a lot more of it. And I think if we share this technological optimism, the question then is, how do you enable this innovation? Because 5G, as operators can deploy those networks, but to really have 5G as a service to the end user, to companies, the innovation has to come in these new services. And when it does, the beauty of it is that it can happen, and it will happen not just in Silicon Valley. It will happen here. It will happen in every single country that we operate in, and that's the beauty of it. And so countries that have actually promoted and enabled innovation are best placed to see 5G being deployed faster, but more importantly, being put to use. And I think that is the optimistic note that I start with and end with. Innovation and the possibility of realizing all this innovation in the markets that we're in.
Thank you very much, Kamal. So we are actually up of time and 2 questions left. So my proposal is everyone gets 1 minute to the 2 questions. 1 minute, and please be disciplined. The first question, what sort of complementarity does fiber bring to 5G networks? And I hand over to Haitham. Haitham?
I think your question around fiber. I think fiber is, 5G will require lots of bandwidth and require lots of, we're going to be seeing consumptions on internet and data. It will be very huge. I think it's going to be very essential and going to be push lots of operators really to roll out, and make sure that they connect all of their sites into fiber. So,
5 minutes.
So I think it's a critical component.
Thank you, Haitham. Over to Paul. 1 minute. We don't hear you.
Yes, thank you. I think it's very straightforward. Sorry. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I think it's very straightforward, as you just heard from Hatem, that you do need the bandwidth at each of the base stations. The G-Node Bs will require at least 10 gigs. So fiber that all the base stations is absolutely mandatory. And if you also consider the deployment options to SMEs and then enterprises, providing 5G services, wireless-based ones, to enterprises, SME is the first step, basically fueling cash flow. Fiber will then follow. So absolutely, it has a place.
Perfect. Femi?
And I would argue a complementary and slightly opposite point, which is 5G would need to replicate the experience in the home that you have over Wi-Fi that is backhauled by fiber. I think users will not or will expect the same experience, at least on their handsets, in the same way on the 5G network on the outside. Obviously, then there's the industry and enterprise that have the SLA demands that was a very good point.
Very good.
Those are from here. Thank you.
Thank you. Ajay?
Yeah, I think from the fiber and 5G, they are going to coexist. And even more, I would say I mean, almost all the points are covered. So I think I will just focus on the front haul and the backhaul connectivity, because I think that's where we definitely need the kind of, especially in the front haul. I think the front haul fiber connectivity is mandatory for getting this low latency applications inbuilt. So,
thank you. Atza?
Absolutely. I think some of the hardware acceleration capabilities are required as part of the infrastructure to actually run some of these 5G components in software. You don't have to go back to the appliance world. You can run it on commercial off-the-shelf equipment, but you need certain capabilities in that commercial off-the-shelf equipment to be able to process signals in time and to be able to run that. So in addition to, of course, fiber that was already mentioned by a number of panelists, I believe the softwareization and the software capabilities and tuning becomes incredibly important to deliver the best experience with respect to 5G.
Thank you. Munir?
I would just add that the disaggregation of the RAN, when we haven't spoken enough about Open RAN that will fuel the 5G growth in the future, will make these broadband connectivity and the reliance on fiber even more critical to enable, again, the promise of Open RAN and the reduction on the simplification of the 5G rollout and the more agility and flexibility that will provide to mobile network operators to roll out, and distribute their RAN networks globally.
And the last one, Kamal?
I agree with everything that's been said. I have nothing to add.
Wow, that was short. With this comment, it was a pleasure, gents, to have this panel together with you guys in a very interesting and very different environment. I hope we will see us next year in person again, and thank you very much.